The rain fell in sheets against the old wooden bridge, a dull, rhythmic drumming that drowned out the rustling of the trees around it. The forest was thick, its towering pines and oaks forming a canopy that let in only slivers of the fading daylight. In the heart of this forest, hidden from the modern world, lay an ancient village that had been abandoned for decades. Locals called it the Forgotten Hollow, a place left to the ghosts of its past. There were many stories about why the village had been deserted. Some claimed a plague had swept through, while others whispered of dark rituals performed in the woods. Whatever the cause, the villagers had vanished almost overnight, leaving their homes and belongings behind as if they had fled in a hurry. The only thing that remained were their secrets, waiting for anyone foolish enough to uncover them. Ivy Collins had always been fascinated by such stories. A budding historian with a penchant for solving mysteries, she had spent the last few months researching the Forgotten Hollow. Every mention of the village seemed to vanish around the late 1800s, and there were no official records of what had happened to the people who once lived there. Ivy, however, was determined to find out. She had gathered enough clues from old maps and cryptic references in journals to pinpoint the village's location. Now, standing at the entrance to the overgrown path that led to it, she felt a mixture of excitement and unease. The forest was darker than she had anticipated, its dense undergrowth making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. But Ivy pressed on, clutching her lantern tightly as she made her way deeper into the woods. After an hour of trudging through the wet underbrush, the trees finally began to thin, and Ivy found herself standing at the edge of the village. It was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft patter of rain against the roofs of the crumbling houses. The air was thick with a musty, damp scent, and Ivy felt a chill run down her spine despite the humidity. The village was smaller than she had imagined, only about a dozen buildings, most of them made from dark wood that had long since rotted. Vines crept up the sides of the houses, and broken windows gaped like empty eyes. Ivy approached the first house cautiously, pushing open the door with a loud creak. Inside, everything was covered in dust and cobwebs. A table stood in the center of the room, with a few wooden chairs scattered around it. Plates and cutlery were still laid out as if someone had been preparing for a meal, but whoever had set the table had never returned. Her lantern flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. Ivy felt as though someone was watching her, though she knew it was impossible. The village had been abandoned for over a century. Still, the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and she found herself glancing over her shoulder more than once. As she moved from house to house, Ivy's unease grew. Each home was the same, empty, yet frozen in time. There were clothes laid out on beds, pots hanging over long-dead fires, and books left open on tables, their pages yellowed with age. It was as if the villagers had simply vanished in the middle of their daily routines. In the last house, Ivy found something different. The furniture had been overturned, and the walls were scratched with long, deep grooves, as if someone, or something, had tried to claw their way out. On the floor, half hidden beneath a pile of debris, Ivy spotted an old, rusted lantern. It was unlike the others she had seen, a tall, iron frame with intricate carvings of strange symbols along its sides. Something about the lantern drew her in, compelling her to pick it up. As her fingers wrapped around the cold metal, a shiver ran through her body. The air around her seemed to shift, and for a brief moment, Ivy felt as if the village itself was holding its breath. She quickly put the lantern into her bag and hurried out of the house, eager to leave the Forgotten Hollow behind. By the time Ivy made it back to her small apartment in the nearby town, night had fallen. She placed the lantern on her desk, wiping the dirt and grime from its surface to reveal the intricate carvings more clearly. The symbols were strange, some looked like ancient runes, while others were shapes that seemed to twist and shift in the dim light. Despite its age, the lantern seemed well preserved, almost as if it had been waiting for someone to find it. Curiosity getting the better of her, Ivy grabbed a match and lit the lantern. The flame flickered for a moment before burning steady, casting a soft, golden glow around the room. For a while, nothing happened. Ivy sat at her desk, studying the carvings more closely, jotting down notes in her journal. But then, just as she was about to extinguish the flame, the light in the lantern began to change. It flickered again, but this time the flame turned a deep, unnatural blue. Ivy watched, mesmerized, as the light pulsed, growing brighter and dimmer in time with her heartbeat. And then, out of nowhere, she heard it, a whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible over the crackling of the flame. But as Ivy strained to listen, the whisper grew louder, more insistent. The voice was soft and low, speaking in a language Ivy couldn't understand. It seemed to be coming from the lantern itself, as if the flame was trying to communicate with her. Her pulse quickened, and she reached out to extinguish the flame. But before she could touch the lantern, the whispering stopped, replaced by a sudden, deafening silence. The room grew colder, and Ivy felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Her eyes darted to the window, but there was nothing outside except the dark, rain-soaked street. And then she saw it. Reflected in the glass of the window was a figure standing behind her, a tall, shadowy silhouette with glowing blue eyes. Ivy's breath caught in her throat, and she spun around, but the room was empty. The only light came from the lantern, which continued to burn with that eerie blue flame. Panic surged through her as she backed away from the desk. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she had seen. But before she could process it, the whispering returned, louder this time, echoing in her ears like a chorus of voices. The flame in the lantern flared, casting strange shadows on the walls. Suddenly, the room was filled with the scent of damp earth and decay, as if the forest itself had crept inside. The walls seemed to close in around her, and the shadows twisted and stretched, taking on forms that were almost human. Ivy stumbled toward the door, her heart pounding in her chest. But as she reached for the handle, the lantern flickered again, and the door slammed shut on its own. The whispers grew deafening, and the shadows seemed to move closer, circling her. Ivy grabbed the lantern and hurled it across the room. It shattered against the wall, the blue flame snuffing out instantly. The room was plunged into darkness, and the whispers stopped as abruptly as they had begun. For a moment, there was only silence. Ivy stood frozen, her back pressed against the door, her breathing ragged. She waited for something to happen, for the shadows to return, for the whispers to resume, but nothing did. The room was still. The lantern lay in pieces on the floor, its light gone. Without wasting another second, Ivy bolted from the room and didn't stop running until she was far from her apartment. She never returned to the Forgotten Hollow, and the lantern was never mentioned again. But from that night on, Ivy couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her home, that some part of the village's dark past had been released when she lit that forgotten lantern. And every now and then, late at night, she could still hear the faintest whisper in the back of her mind, calling her back to the shadows.